Foreign policy, a trip to Capitol Hill, and a briefing on COVID response. Those were just some of the big items on President Biden's agenda today, almost 11 months into his first term. He kicked off the day speaking to leaders around the world about the importance of global democracy.
Democracy needs champions. And I wanted to host this summit because here in the United States, we know as well as anyone that renewing our democracy and strengthening our democratic institutions requires constant effort.
Our White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor joins me now to talk about the president's agenda. Yamiche, hello. So we know at this summit for democracy, the president certainly in the background is having to deal with an array of foreign policy challenges. Remind us what those are.
Well, as you said, Judy, this was a day that really was a microcosm of the challenges that President Biden faces. His schedule today really laid out the biggest challenges of presidency, whether it was the Democracy Summit, whether it was COVID and his meeting with the task force, or whether it was him going over to Capitol Hill and paying his respects to the late Senator Bob Dole. Now, when it comes to foreign policy at the Democracy Summit, where he brought together more than 100 countries, the president essentially said that democracy is a fragile thing that needs to be protected. He also, though, had a feeling of humility, saying that the United States understands, just as other countries, how much democracy needs to be protected. Now, I talked to a senior administration official who told me that the president essentially approached that because of January 6th and the issues with our own democracy with a mix of determination to improve American democracy and also a mix of confidence that he could still be a leader because the United States, the officials here see it as a beacon of hope still. Then when you add, of course, the other foreign policy challenges, there's Russia and China, two countries that were not invited to the summit. Both of them were critical of the summit. The Chinese Foreign Ministry released a statement and a stinging report on the state of American democracy, saying in part that this really is a country that is ruled by money. When you look at Russia, of course, following the meeting and the call, I should say rather, with President Putin and President Biden, Russian officials also criticized the summit. And also the president, of course, has said that he issued a pretty stinging statement, a pretty straightforward statement to President Putin, saying that if Russia were to invade Ukraine, that there would be strong economic sanctions levied on that country. So those are just some of the foreign policy challenges, along with, of course, the continuing issues with the consequences of the Afghanistan withdrawal that the president is facing.
And then, of course, Yamiche, there is his domestic agenda. We know the Build Back Better piece of legislation still working its way through Congress. But how is the rest of where does the rest of the agenda stand, and how is all that affecting his standing among American voters?
Well, this is really at the heart of the domestic issues that the president is facing. He was able to get through some big policy issues, but there is really this approval rating issue, as well as a perception that maybe the Biden administration isn't getting a lot of stuff done, even when Democratic lawmakers are saying we have a lot to celebrate as Democrats. Of course, that's what they're saying. Now, I want to point out that Joe Manchin, and put up for people that Joe Manchin is carrying around a card. That's critical senator from West Virginia. He's been carrying around a card listing some of the accomplishments that Democrats have made. I want to read some of them to you. In March, $1.9 trillion passed as part of the American Rescue Plan that was really focused on COVID relief. Then in May, a COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, really focusing on making sure that people weren't targeted because of their ethnicity. Then in November, $1 trillion infrastructure investment. That, of course, was the bipartisan infrastructure plan. But here's where things get interesting. You look at the president's approval ratings. They approve of him 42%, 51%. But when you compare that to infrastructure, 56% to 31%. So what that really shows is that the president's approval ratings are lower than what people see his infrastructure plans and his agenda. And that is the issue that the president's really trying to bridge, and the issue that is really in some ways dominating the conversations at the White House here.
And just quickly, Yamiche, we know COVID is also a continuing challenge for the president.
That's right. I mean, the pandemic is something that's top of mind. The Omicron variant, the president just sat down with the COVID response team here at the White House. I was in the room. The president was not taking questions, but I shouted a question about rapid tests because that's something that has not been as available to Americans as they have been in other countries. So that is still the #1 priority, getting this pandemic under control. The president says it, and it is the thing that is absolutely dominating all of the other sectors, all of the other things that we've been talking about tonight.
Yamiche Alcindor reporting from the White House. Thank you, Yamiche.
Thanks so much.